Um, there we go. The format for today is about half presentation and then followed by breakout room discussions. I'll talk a little bit more about the agenda in a minute, but just to let you know, it's about half more interactive and half providing some overviews of recent research. We're happy to take comments and questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring the chat throughout. But we will pause at key points to invite some questions from the group, and there'll be opportunity in the breakout groups for the second half to share information, share insights. And if you do want to ask a question more directly or a point of clarification, feel free to use the raise hand feature during the meeting. Okay, next slide. And there we go. First slide here. Okay, so to start, the focus of this session is on market methods for incentivizing conservation. And we have a panel of presenters for this meeting. And I thought we'd start with some introductions, and then I'll go into the goals for this session and a bit of background information. So my name is Maura. I'm an economist and a principal with Industrial Economics Incorporated, IEC. I've been working on socioeconomic dimensions of species and habitat conservation and environmental restoration in Washington for about 20 years now, with a number of state agencies as well as with federal agencies in that context. And this work is being done as part of a contract that or my part in it, that IEC holds with the Puget Sound Partnership to provide economic support. The session or the series in general, the Lunch and Learn series, is a collaborative effort of industrial economics as well as Oregon State University and the Puget Sound Institute, all social science and incentives-based focus of 3 separate sessions. And we have presentations from DFW and from some work that IEC has done recently. So I'm going to invite those presenters to introduce themselves. Braeden, do you want to go next?
Hi, everybody. My name is Braeden Van Deynze. I'm the natural resource economist at Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I've been working in the Puget Sound area on various natural resource issues for about 5 years now. Turn it to Kelly.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kelly McCaffrey. I'm in the Puget Sound section of Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm working on incentives as an environmental planner with the Shore Friendly program and with our Puget Sound folks and friends.
And my name is Ben Blatchley. I'm a resource economist and a senior associate at IEC, Industrial Economics. My particular expertise is in non-market valuation of ecosystem services. And in recent years, I've been applying that to understand various economic aspects of habitat restoration in Washington State, among other things.
Great. Thanks, Al. So agenda-wise for today, we have a bit of a background presentation. It's designed, the presentations today are designed to be accessible for everyone, so no particular technical expertise or experience with incentives programs required. We understand that some of the people participating are new to the idea of market-based incentives and how they're defined and how they work, and others are real experts, especially with expertise in particular programs. So our goal today is to promote a shared understanding of what these tools are, how they're being applied, what research is going on in the Puget Sound region, but it's meant to be relatively high level. And then second is, we described in the flyer for this series, this is meant to be a sort of a two-way learning opportunity here. So we are providing information, as I mentioned, to provide insight into how these tools work and what they are. And we're hoping to learn from you about the kinds of challenges that you face with respect to market incentives programs, where you think there could be opportunities for them, so that following the discussion and in the breakout groups, we can synthesize that information to identify areas where additional research or attention could help further ecological restoration objectives in the Puget Sound region. Okay, next slide. So now, I think first, we are hearing from the community. The Puget Sound Institute has developed and maintains what many of you know as the Grand Uncertainties Matrix, which is a series of questions related to uncertainties with respect to achieving ecological restoration objectives. And in looking through the Grand Uncertainties Matrix, I identified about 20 questions that I would think of as related to incentives in general, incentivizing behavior, not all market-based, but they range from very, very broad, for example, do incentives work and what's the best strategy for behavior change, to much more specific and about individual programs or goals, like how to impact fees differ between rural and urban environments, with the idea of understanding how that works. These example questions came from were identified in the development of regional recovery plans, but there was a series, about 20 of them. And the discussions in the action agenda workshops also underscored the idea of better understanding and better where incentives can fit in promoting Puget Sound ecosystem recovery. There's also a lot of active research underway. Puget Sound Institute's been working on a catalog of existing incentive programs, and Ray Everard, who's a co-host of this call here, is managing that catalog, and that will be part of a future, I think the second in our Lunch and Learn series. There's also a riparian task force focused on understanding incentives and how to accelerate participation in voluntary incentive programs for riparian conservation and restoration. Work on the shore friendly and the grant program there, different payments to landowner strategies. So there's a lot going on in the region. And so it seemed like a good time for a dialogue on that. Next slide. So what are the purpose of market incentives? So many ecological challenges, as you're likely aware, require private landowner action. So many important habitats are flow through or exist on private land. We count on landowners, on businesses, on residents of the region to be good actors in the environmental space. But some of the costs of restoration and recovery fall onto private entities. So landowners or businesses might incur the costs, whereas the benefits are experienced more broadly by the public. So ecological benefits like clean water and habitat and climate resilience, we consider these to be public goods. They're borne broadly by the public, where the costs can fall on the private landowners. And that can be direct implementation costs of restoration projects sometimes, but often foregone revenue, foregone business revenue, if their land is in an alternative productive use, or a time investment, or some level of increased risk potentially to their property or their business of investing in ecosystem recovery. In economics, we call this a market failure. This is a classic market failure. So the private entity is not experiencing the full benefits of the activity, and so they are under-incentivized to behave in a socially optimal way. So we refer to any ecological harm that results from that underinvestment as a negative externality in the context of economic analysis. Next slide. So then what do market incentives do is that they better align those private decisions with the public ecological goals. They step in to realign costs and benefits so that the optimal behavior is incentivized. Market incentives are tools that use financial or market systems to achieve those objectives. Essentially, they internalize the public benefit or internalize the value that the public gets from the ecological improvement into these decisions, into these voluntary decisions that landowners or businesses or others may face. So with voluntary incentives, landowners or businesses, they are likely to participate in these programs or undertake the desired behavior if they understand the benefits to them will exceed the cost to them. Those benefits don't have to be monetary. It can be lots of different kinds of benefits that a landowner or a private entity can experience from an activity, including if they have an environmental ethic that motivates their behavior. The private entity would not participate if they foresee that the costs outweigh the benefits. So the incentives are designed to tip that balance to incorporate those public benefits and reward the private landowner for that behavior. Next slide. So as I mentioned, market incentives, they're programs or tools that use these financial or market mechanisms to align costs and benefits toward the desired behavior. It makes these behaviors become more attractive or profitable to the intended behavior change that you're trying to incentivize. So the landowner or the business or developers, perhaps. There's not a common lexicon agreed upon for market incentives, what that means. But very generally, the word market is, it sounds like a misnomer if we're not talking about businesses that exchange supply and demand in goods and services between one another. But the term is generally used in some way to describe that these programs are assigning a monetary value for nature, either implicitly or explicitly, by incorporating that public benefit into the decision analysis, whether it's via the government paying for the outcome or in another way. They're often referred to as market-based instruments or MBIs. Sometimes you'll hear price-based instruments, economic incentives, financial incentive programs, market conservation tools. These generally mean the same things. And there are related concepts too that are in the same family: environmental markets, payments for ecosystem services. We often think of carbon markets for that, but certainly riparian payments to landowner programs count there too, and ecosystem service markets. So why do we want to associate a monetary value with nature in the context of these programs is the question. Move to the next slide. And it's essentially to shift that benefit cost analysis decision for the behavior you're trying to change. This slide highlights certain categories of market-based incentive programs that we think of as relatively simple incentives. We provide some examples that are relevant in Washington, though this is a subset of the programs that exist. As I mentioned, there is Puget Sound Institute has a catalog of existing programs. But simple incentives don't require establishing a market, but they often pay more directly or penalize decisions financially. So this includes grants, payments, and cost share programs where you're compensating for costs or providing financial rewards for the desired behavior. This essentially reduces the costs of participating in these programs. So the Water Quality Combined Funding Program, Rainwise rebates, they all fit into these relatively simple and straightforward categories. The taxes and penalties kind of do the opposite here. They charge for the undesired activity or the harmful activity, and they make that behavior more costly. So the open space tax exemption makes it relatively attractive to preserve land in current open space use or agriculture or forest use relative to potentially higher and better use at a higher tax rate. Certifications are also an example of a relatively simple market incentive. So here's where we basically generate more recognition for good actors to increase their competitiveness in a market. Some common labels are, people think of Energy Star or Salmon Safe is another one that can improve the market share that a company has by being a good actor in that space. So there's also more complex market incentives, and these often require developing a market or working with a regulatory process. So there's a regulation that exists that, for example, limits carbon emissions or water pollution, and then the incentives program creates a market to better achieve compliance with these regulations. So these are a little bit more complex, but also exist in Washington state. Reverse auctions provide competitive bidding where landowners can signal what amount of money they'd be willing to accept to change their behavior. The Conservation Reserve Program has done this, for example. Tradable permits, so a tradable market for meeting those regulatory limits or caps, which allows some flexibility in how businesses or others achieve compliance. The King County Transfer of Development Rights meets this definition. Cap and trade programs meet this definition. And then there are offset markets as well. So the offset markets establish markets for purchasing credits for mitigation for activities to facilitate compliance. Wetland mitigation banking is a really common example of that. And the Puget Sound Partnership Nearshore Credits Program is another example of the offset market in Washington state. Okay, One really common payment for ecosystem services or a market-based incentive program are carbon markets. The next couple slides here just highlight some recent research that that we did in this space for Puget Sound Partnership to help local integrating organizations and others at largely at local scales understand the carbon markets in the state and where there's potential for projects, conservation projects or activities to be accelerated by leveraging these markets. So IEC created a guidebook. This work was led by Megan Sheehan and Webster Batista Lynn here at IEC. And the intent was to provide a reference that can be shared with partners in the region. This is in a draft form now, but I thought I'd share it here. The goal of the information synthesis was to provide land managers with practical information about where there's potential for forest, agriculture, and blue carbon markets to support some restoration and conservation efforts. It mostly involves synthesizing perspectives from the literature, but also interviews with different entities around Washington State who are working in this space. And the guidebook includes links to resources, checklists, example projects, and guidance for different kinds of projects and how to pursue these markets and where there's potential. So this slide here just highlights some of the ongoing work in this space in Washington. And in the interest of time, I'm actually going to go to the next slide so we can make sure to get to some of the other presentations. But the key takeaways from this work were largely that the carbon markets present a promising opportunity for funding projects, but there are still some challenges and that they're in a period of rapid development in Washington State as in other places. We also found that most nature-based projects in Washington have sold carbon credits through the voluntary carbon markets as opposed to any compliance credit markets, but that the Cap and Invest program is actively seeking opportunities for local projects to participate, and that may be a natural marketplace for some projects in the coming years. Pretty much everyone we spoke to highlighted that there are significant participation barriers for small projects and implementing entities with limited staff. So the guidebook identifies those challenges and highlights ways that they can leverage resources across the state to promote participation in carbon markets for smaller projects. We also found that forest and tree projects are currently the most established segment of the market, and that there's been less in the ag space, and that the blue carbon markets are really just emerging. So I think overall, many projects in Washington might be well positioned to use blue carbon markets as a market-based incentive in the future, but the protocols applicable in the region to establish those projects and make sure that they're delivering the benefits that they should be is still an active area of research. But there is an active network of groups that are working in this space, and we recommend following those efforts and those entities for progress over time. Okay. Next slide. So I'll pause briefly there and see, are there any high-level questions that we can cover now before we get into 2 presentations of ongoing research? Okay. Hearing none then, I'm going, oh, I see, sorry, Kathleen.
Hi, I can't share my video because I'm blocked, so I'll just turn on my sound. Thank you for that great presentation, and I just wanted to quickly share one idea from our LAO action plans in the space of the open space taxation benefit. One thing that we had started talking about was, could we add a category for shoreline restoration, like bulkhead removal, that would enable us to, move from doing projects on a parcel by parcel scale, but like having them by neighborhood scale. I mean, that is just one benefit, but that was something that was in our LAO action plan that I've been meaning to talk with many of you about. So I'm throwing it out here since it's opportune. And I'd be curious if that is in this report or if that's something you've talked about.
That's not mentioned in the carbon markets report, but it's a great flag for some of the questions we have in the breakout groups about opportunities really where market-based incentives can be expanded or developed to better incentivize the kind of behavior change that you're looking for. So that's exactly what we're hoping to get out of the feedback in the discussion section. So I appreciate you raising it.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay. I think next I'm going to turn this over to Braeden and Kelly for presenting some work they're doing at WDFW.
Great, thank you, Maura. Hi again, everybody. Again, my name is Braeden Van Dynes. I'm presenting today with Kelly McCaffrey. I'd also like to acknowledge Lena Lay at WSU's Social and Economic Science Research Center, who was instrumental in the work we're presenting today. Today, we're going to be presenting some work in progress. Kelly and I have been working, well, really since we both started at the agency 3.5 years ago, on doing research to support the development of more sophisticated incentive programs to encourage healthy shoreline management behaviors. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kelly.
Cool. Okay. Sounds good, Braeden. I think I know a lot of people on this call, and yeah, so we're just going to give this context because the call is about, the meeting is about incentives, and not everybody necessarily works in shorelines. So some of this is a review for some of you, but Fish and Wildlife, we have this authority to regulate hydraulic permits, and our focus here in this research has to do with marine shorelines. Fish and Wildlife offers technical assistance for residential stewardship in their armor alternatives analysis when someone goes for an HPA for like a bulkhead or for a removal of one. And hard armor it restricts ecological processes on our shoreline. So going back to what Maura was saying, a public benefit is these ecological processes of the connection between the land and the shore. So this armor creates habitat harm. So we have provided an incentive menu through our Shore Friendly program now since 2014 through grants and technical assistance. And since then, a lot of stuff has changed. We have sea level rise and mapping and just so much information and sociopolitical change and climate change, and all these things are changing. So continue. And we've done a lot of mapping, like I said, and there's been other social science research. Maura and her group has helped us with sort of some of that too. And so now we're at this point where we really want to do more, and we want to do better. And we know that our shorelines are at risk. And so we're just looking at, this notion that was brought up back in 2014 when the grants and technical assistance through Shore Friendly started, about leveraging incentives through loans, introducing subsidized loans. So we're researching that. That's what this has been about. Braeden and I have worked together with SESRC. We want to have accurate demand before we really go forward and really put this thing forward. So some of our key research questions, or what's the appetite for like loan incentives? What's the demand and the willingness to pay, the variability for different shoreline project types? That was in our research. We focused on hard armor, soft shore, and natural shoreline. What we want is natural shoreline, of course, but we had to present the various options so that we could see how people were, what their willingness to pay is for each of them, and included also structure relocation, considering sea level rise. You move a structure back and you potentially can remove the armor, or there would be less need for it. What is the effect of different financial incentive types on this demand? The research included focused on construction loans and mini grants. And I think Braeden will talk a little bit more about that later. And how does demand vary across these various variables? Property owner demographics, experiences. Have they experienced a storm event? Does that make them more likely to be interested? Their property characteristics, what kind of shoreline are they have right now, structures, and their familiarity with the shoreline, with the Shore Friendly education outreach program already. Go ahead. Next slide. That's you, right?
Yeah. All right, so to answer these research questions, we need to work with a model of residential shoreline property owners' decision-making when they're considering updates to their shorelines. And so what I mean by that is a model is a helpful tool for organizing our thoughts about these choices and the incentives that property owners face. So as a starting point, we use a common economics modeling framework known as utility maximization. We assume property owners derive utility or value from their shoreline management structures, and that different alternatives have different attributes that each property owner considers. These attributes are things like whether or not it protects their home from storms, aesthetics, whether or not they think it looks nice and they like the landscaping, space for activities. A lot of shoreline property owners will use that space between their home and the water for a lawn or for picnic space or deck space. Supporting healthy ecosystems, like Maura alluded to earlier. Some property owners have environmental ethic, and they will pursue that through the decisions on their properties, with or without incentives. And different property owners likely put different weights on each of these factors. We also assume that each property owner has a budget and that each property has a price. Each project has a price. And then when faced with a distinct set of projects, the property owner will choose the one that provides the most utility or best meets their preferences for the lowest cost. Because preferences and budgets differ, we expect people to make different choices when faced with similar situations. So for example, person one in here, they might pick the armored project on the left, even if it's significantly more expensive than the soft project on the right. Meanwhile, person two might pick the more natural project, even if it's slightly more expensive, perhaps due to an aesthetic preference or a desire to support healthy shorelines. And if we observe many choices, project features, and prices from many property owners, we can estimate willingness to pay or demand on average and among certain subpopulations for these different shore forms. Now, where do incentives come into play here? Okay, let's consider the same model, but with financial incentives. For example, small grants or low interest construction loans. Using this decision framework, we can treat the incentive as another project feature alongside the price and the armoring features. If the incentive is working, some property owners will make different decisions than they would absent the incentive. So in this example, person one would now choose the natural shoreline over the armored alternative when the subsidized loan is offered. On the other hand, person two is still choosing the natural shoreline, so the incentive likely didn't have an effect. Similarly, there might also be people who would have picked the armored project in the scenario without incentives, and they're likely to continue to do so even when the incentives are available. So this leaves two questions, right? First, how many property owners would change their decisions when the incentives are made available? And then second, who or which ones are going to be impacted by this incentive offering? So to bring data to these questions, we conducted a survey of Puget Sound residential property owners. We targeted owner addresses from privately owned shorelines, shoreline parcels with homes as of 2018, of which there were about 36,500 in our database. This includes about 19,000 armored properties and 17,000 unarmored properties as of the most recent survey. Of these 36,000 property owners, we randomly sampled about 10,000, and each property owner was contacted with a letter with WDFW letterhead and a $2 incentive to incentivize participation with 2 reminder postcards. And each mailing included a link to a web survey with unique access code. The survey was deployed in March through April earlier this year, and we received nearly 4,000 responses, or over 41% response when we account for ineligible properties. That response rate was pretty high for modern survey research, and we have some ideas for why that might be that we'll touch on a little bit later. So what was in the survey? There were 5 parts. First, we established eligibility by confirming details about the property, including the respondent's capacity to participate in decision-making. Second, we asked about the shoreline management history of the property, including its current structures and the age of those structures, as well as their property owner's experiences with maintenance and replacement. Third, we conducted what is known as a discrete choice experiment, where respondents are presented with alternative shoreline projects at different hypothetical costs and with different hypothetical financial incentives. And using these simulated decisions, we can quantitatively measure demand for both shoreline forms and the impact of financial incentives on that demand. Next, we asked follow-up questions about the factors affecting their decisions, where they get their information about shoreline management, including their familiarity with shore-friendly, and information about their insurance coverage and septic tank position. And finally, we asked some basic questions about respondent demographics, as well as some more specialized questions related to their financial situation that may be relevant for whether or not they would be eligible for loans. So I'll talk briefly in more detail about the discrete choice experiment. Discrete choice experiments are a method developed by economists for measuring demand for novel products and product features in markets that might not exist yet. So this method is used in marketing to price things like cars and smartphones, but also by natural resource economists to measure preferences for restoration projects, environmental programs, and over recreational opportunities like fishing season set. In our choice experiment, respondents were presented with a choice scenario. Each scenario included 3 distinct projects that would replace their current shoreline at the end of its functional life and an opt-out option. Each project was presented as a bundle of attributes, and we include two attributes that relate to the changes to the property, including the shoreline erosion management, that's the armor, the soft shore engineered, or the natural shoreline that Kelly mentioned earlier, and the position of the property or the position of the home on the property. So whether the home is remains in the same location or is moved back. We also included 2 types of financial incentives, small grants and low interest rate loans. And finally, each project had an associated cost that was scaled to the length of the shoreline and the size of the home. Each respondent completed 6 of these scenarios, providing us with several thousand simulated decisions over these hypothetical projects and hypothetical incentives. And so using that, we'll be able to statistically analyze these choices to reveal the trade-offs that respondents are willing to make between cost and these other attributes and the influence of these incentives on those trade-offs. So we're still working on analyzing those data from the choice experiment, but I did want to share some early results from the demographics portion of our survey, because we think that these are really interesting and they are informing what we expect to see when we dig deeper into the DCE data. Note that these results are preliminary and may change as we continue our analysis, so please don't use these data in decision-making quite yet. So what we learned is, on average, shoreline residential property owners are more likely to be seniors. They're significantly older than the population of Puget Sound. They're more likely to be retired. In fact, over 2/3 were retired. They're more likely to be high income and highly educated. Because of these demographics, we are hypothesizing that the typical property owner, so the average property owner, is less likely to be receptive to change. They're more likely to be committed to that status quo on their property. They're more likely to be less receptive to long-term commitments, including loans potentially. And they're also less likely to be receptive to financial incentives overall because of their high incomes and large budgets. So as we move forward, we're going to be testing these hypotheses with the DCE data that we collected. And we're also hoping to identify relevant subpopulations, so folks that perhaps aren't seniors or have lower incomes that may have different behavior because of the different incentives that they're facing.
Oh, that's me. Okay. Yeah, go click to the next circuit. Prompt me, thank you. Okay, so yeah, so basically what Braeden was saying, kind of teeing off that, the data that we were collecting is also informing the analysis, and it's also just flat out data, just understanding our demographic for as we're continuing to adapt our incentive programs, right? So this is just, again, this is some preliminary findings. Not surprising, these factors in decision-making, cost, durability, effectiveness, protection from sea level rise, they're thinking about their property assets. Very few identified fish and wildlife habitat in their top 3, but that doesn't mean that people don't care. It just means it was not in their top 6 factors of just shoreline decision making. And this is their mindset in a really dynamic environment in which they're living, right? And then we're hoping, kind of one of the questions that popped up in the chat I saw, are you going to look at like retired versus not retired? You know, we are going to be filtering, like what Braeden said, the different characteristics of folks so that we can also make some forecasting or proxy, understand a little bit more about the whole data set, the whole population. So for instance, if there's greater demand among folks who are really familiar with shore friendly, then can we assume that by investing in more technical assistance that we'd have more demand? Another question could be, in our analysis is, if there's greater demand among people who have already expensed themselves with high costs from frequent storm damage or experience a lot of storms, some of the questions in the survey, can we assume that with sea level rise and more storms to come, that there might be then greater demand from folks like that as well? But we didn't, what we're not assuming, sorry, go back, is we don't assume anything about their intended lifespan on the parcel, their succession planning. We don't assume anything like that, but we did ask questions about like insurance, like long-term risk, but we don't assume anything either. Just some general data for understanding their mindset. Next slide. And then also this data that we collected informs for developing an incentive loan program. If we are going to do that, we have to have a partner agency, and we would be working with an underwriter, and these are things that they need to know. And we would need to know if, you know, we think this is financially viable. So structure failure in general is sort of an opportunistic a point of entry for technical assistance and investment on properties, whether it be an ARMOR alternative or so we're keeping track of these work too. Okay, sorry, got distracted. Maura. It's an entry point for technical assistance and investment. And so, you know, can we kind of get a sense for like how old is some of the structures on these properties? They will likely fail. So therefore, you know, what's a likelihood that we will continue to have demand for these sorts of investments for these sorts of projects? Next, click. And also just you need to have viable collateral on property in order to you know, lend money and to borrow money. So these sorts of questions we asked happen to do with like ownership length, primary, secondary ownership, equity in the home, and people answered them. And it's really helpful for us to understand. At the same time, those things may change depending on markets that we don't have control over, you know, in the shoreline space, like residential markets. So what are we doing with this information? You know, we'll report our findings in November. We'll be having some policy discussions at Fish and Wildlife about technical assistance, about loans. No matter what, I will just sort of caveat, like technical assistance is critical for any regulatory program. So like we have regulatory, shore friendly is not part of the regulatory program, but you have to have technical assistance in order it complements any of your regulatory actions. So with or without incentives, technical assistance is critical, just kind of throwing that out there. And it's also going to inform, we have some funding from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for a pilot program to design a sustainable finance building block in shoreline spaces conducive to restoration. Whether it will be residential loans, I can't say right now, but this information should help us, but we still have this funding to do something financing. So timing's not awesome. And then the targeted outcomes obviously are shore-friendly adaptation and improvement, effectiveness and whatnot in our incentive work, our shoreline strategy at Fish and Wildlife, and just for the context of, you know, folks who are involved in incentives in other riparian or like, you know, yards and lots of different incentive programming, right? This was our scenario, and our demographic is understanding incentive loan effectiveness among older and higher income earners, amongst folks who aren't as well, in an asset vulnerable residential scenario. Next slide. You can kind of blow through this for maybe just go to the first two. Yeah. So just in the context for the panel discussion for later too, you know, what we were operating with is I think about these incentives and are designing this program for changing behavior in the shorelines. It's behavior change equals incentive plus force plus reduced friction. That's a behavioral economist Yuri Nizi kind of laid that out for me, and I find that to be really helpful in thinking about how we're shifting or how we're focusing on our adjustments or adaptation or how we design an incentive. And force was not included. It was sort of like a constant in our research, so that was not adjusted. But were you to adjust that, you might see different results in people's choices. But that was not part of our research, so I just want to put that out there. And then the origins of this whole incentive loan stuff was about leveraging incentives. That was the whole concept originally. It was back in 2014, the Ecosystem Coordination Board, and they were looking at Maryland and blah, blah, blah background, because this is a dynamic environment that living on the shoreline. So there's regular and frequent private investment in their asset. And so the idea is, okay, if they're already investing, let's leverage that and see if we can't get provide a lower interest rate so that they're investing in the kind of alternatives that we want them to invest in. And that's because we also saw shoreline homes as being generally scarce, so their values are higher. So there's more equity in their homes generally for borrowing and as collateral if the home is not at risk, which then you add sea level rise, and that adds a lot of topsy-turvy. Next. And it's also important to be looking at this concept of demand for these incentives because we want to scale up. And so, the whole idea behind the loans again is, if they're going to work is, ecological processes per dollar spent means efficiency. So the original hypothesis was you add in loans, you have more efficiency because the money is repaid. But that only works if the demand is sufficient and the risk is low. So that's another reason why we were trying to get a little more fine-tuned on the demand. And then just last thing I'll say for this topic in shoreline space anyway, is this is so dynamic, and we're working in a really dynamic space, not only just the shoreline, but markets, insurance markets, politics, and all of the above. So how will that accelerate risk to collateral? Will it change demand? We don't have a crystal ball, but we're hoping that some of the information that we've gathered in this research will help us in understanding all that and decide about opportunity cost of this or something else in the future. That's it.
Thanks,
I think
Kelly and Braeden.
we're running a little over time, so I think I'll turn it over to Ben and Maura, and we can hit on questions maybe at the very end. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks both. That was great. Yeah, and we are. So we'll go through Ben's presentation, but there's opportunity also to ask questions and provide insight on what you've heard in the breakout rooms too. So I'm going to pass it along to Ben.
Thanks, Maura. So I'm again Ben Blatchley. I'm with IEC, and I'm presenting a recently completed project on designing incentive payments for riparian conservation. I want to mention that I'm presenting on behalf of the broader project team, which includes myself and Maura from IEC, some others from IEC, and also Barbara Weiss from another firm called Highland Economics. I also want to acknowledge that the work was funded by Ecology and managed by the State Conservation Commission. And then finally, I'd like to thank many folks, some of whom are on this call, who provided comments on draft versions of this project. So those include folks from SCC and Ecology, also DFW, Puget Sound Institute, and a couple of the CDs, including Snohomish. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. So restoring and conserving natural land cover in the riparian zone obviously generates a whole host of public benefits. And when riparian land is publicly owned, it's relatively straightforward to manage for those public benefits. On privately owned lands, though, managing for public benefits imposes costs on private landowners who might derive some value from keeping the land in some alternative use, as Maura was suggesting in the first presentation. And that misalignment of incentives means that riparian conservation is going to be unlikely on private lands without some kind of intervention. That's a problem in the Puget Sound region because a significant portion of land in the riparian zone is actually privately owned. So what we're trying to do with incentive programs here is to compensate landowners for the costs that they incur when they manage their own lands for public benefit. And the goal of our specific research here was to better understand how we can design landowner payments to accelerate participation in these programs. Next slide. And we broke that into two sort of sub-questions here that we used to guide our research. And actually, if you just go right to the next slide, I'll walk through both the questions and answers that are, the answers are conceptually anyways relatively simple, although a little bit complex in practice. So first, how can we increase enrollment? First, again, it's relatively simple conceptually. We pay landowners for all of the costs that they incur when they enroll in a program. And this first question was actually our primary focus. But what we quickly found out is that there's a lot of variation across landowners in the costs that they face. And at the same time, there's variation in the benefits that are provided by enrolling different parcels. So what that means is that each contract is offering a different level of benefits at a different cost. And when that's the case, how can we think about which contracts are likely to generate higher returns on these public investments? And that's where the cost effectiveness piece comes in. So speaking to that second question there, I'll talk a little bit at the end about jointly considering costs alongside ecological prioritization. Next slide, please. We know that we need to pay landowners. Sorry, no, you're on the right slide. So we know that we need to pay landowners for all the costs that they face, and we can start giving some structure to that by defining categories of costs. So the first category is landowner opportunity costs. And in this context, opportunity costs refer to the value to the landowner of keeping the land in its current use. So if we're talking about an ag producer, they might be using the land to grow crops, and that generates some income. When that's the case, we wouldn't expect them to take that land out of production without receiving some compensation. The second category, what are we asking the landowner to do? What are we asking them to install some fencing, to establish some native plantings, engage in some kind of ongoing maintenance? Well, we acknowledge, of course, that that all takes time and money, and we should be compensating them for that as well. And then aside from those harder costs, there can be other non-monetary factors that influence their decision to participate in a program. So for example, if a landowner values autonomy, full compensation for those hard costs might still be insufficient to generate enrollment. On the converse side, if a landowner is conservation minded, they might accept a payment that's actually a little bit lower than the value of those hard costs. So again, while it sounds simple, compensating landowners for all of their costs gets complex pretty quickly here. Next slide. So how do we estimate those landowner costs in order to set payments in practice? And there are a couple of different approaches that I've categorized here, and I'm actually going to work from right to left. So in a reverse auction, what you're doing is soliciting bids from landowners. And in that case, the payment level is actually determined by the bidding process itself. So the program manager is evaluating bids that come in and choosing the ones that offer the best value. So theoretically, at least, you end up with targeted payments that reflect the full range of costs that are facing individual landowners. In practice, that evaluation process can be sort of complex, and that might act as a deterrent to participation. Alternatively, you have what are called posted price programs. In those, you're offering a landowner a set amount in order to participate, and then they make the decision about whether to accept the payment and to participate or not. So there, it's a little bit different. The program manager is setting the payment, so they're left with the question of determining what's an appropriate payment to offer. And there are two general approaches to that. So you can survey a particular population, and you get a sense of what level of participation you might accept at different payment levels. And then there's a model-based approach where you're looking at observable landowner characteristics and then developing models to understand the costs that they're likely to face. And for this work, we really focused in on developing a model-based approach based on available data, so that we could develop, a system for incorporating models that could be easily incorporated into existing programs. Next slide. And we combined those models into what we called an incentives toolbox. And basically, the toolbox contains models and data sources that can be used to estimate opportunity costs, implementation costs, and maintenance costs. So all of the costs, the sort of more observable hard costs associated with enrolling a particular landowner in a particular program for a particular time period. And I'm going to focus here just on the opportunity cost piece. Next slide, please. So within the toolbox, we are identifying slightly different approaches based on whether we're talking about ag producers or residential landowners. And within agricultural, we're identifying different models associated with different agricultural land uses. So if the land is being used to produce crops, taking that cropland out of production is going to reduce revenue to the farmer, so money coming in, but it's also going to reduce some of their costs, right? So they're not going to need to plant or harvest those particular lands. So what they're giving up is the net operating income associated with the land that's in the riparian zone. And that's a relatively simple calculation of revenue minus costs. If they're using that land instead to feed livestock, they'd need to replace that feed source. So we'd want to compensate them based on the cost of replacing that feed source. And finally, if the area is unfarmed, we might think about what income they could potentially be generating. For example, if they were to rented out. And then for residential properties, there's generally no loss of revenue, right? So here we're thinking more directly about the lost potential for future development, and we would compensate that based on the market value of the land. Then at the next level down here, we're considering some additional factors that modify the opportunity cost. So obviously crop type is hugely important. When you have a perennial crop, you might need to think about additionally reimbursing the landowner for one-time upfront costs that are associated with establishing that crop, in addition to kind of the annual lost revenue, lost net income. On smaller farms, where taking the land in the riparian zone out of production might threaten the overall viability of the farm. If that's the case, it might not be sufficient to just compensate for lost production. Then there's the role of expectations, right? So if producers think prices are likely to rise in the future, a payment that's based on today's net income might not be enough to motivate enrollment in, across multiple years. So to just kind of summarize the toolbox, it contains a whole bunch of models and data sources that can be used to estimate landowner opportunity costs based on what we think are the primary factors driving variation. You can go to the next slide. So to move a bit to our second research question here, we're assuming now that you have some sense from that sort of modeling approach of what the cost is for enrolling a particular landowner. How then can we consider whether a particular payment is cost effective or whether it's producing a good return on public investment? So ideally, we'd be able to express the benefits in monetary terms and then just do a simple benefit cost comparison. So we know that the public places a high value on the services that are provided by riparian restoration. And of course, methods exist for monetizing those values. But the main issue in practice is that it's really complex to untangle the incremental contribution of an individual parcel to that kind of value. So that sort of parcel by parcel or contract by contract cost benefit analysis is not really a practical solution. You can go to the next slide. So what we developed was a relatively simplified framework here to qualitatively evaluate the relative cost effectiveness of enrolling different parcels based on what we do know about observable drivers of cost and ecological value. So we developed a set of ecological value indicators to categorize a parcel as likely to generate low, medium, or high ecological value. And that's based on things like fish potential with a special focus on salmonids, habitat quality, levels of threats and stressors, and connections to human uses like swimming, fishing, drinking water, that kind of thing. We do the same with cost based on things like opportunity cost of land, the complexity of implementing and maintaining the buffer, willingness of the landowner to participate. So then based on those categorizations across the X and Y axis, the cost and ecological value axes here, you're able to place each potential contract into this 9x9 grid based on the likelihood that it will generate a net public benefit. And one thing that's especially important to point out here is that if a parcel happens to fall on the lower end, for example, expected to generate low ecological value, but at a very high cost, it doesn't necessarily generate or suggest that the parcel is not going to generate benefits, but just that other parcels might represent better opportunities. Next slide. Finally, I just want to wrap up here with some related topics that came up over the course of the project that we think are especially important. One is about developing riparian buffer design practices or recommendations in order to maximize the ecological benefits. Another is about understanding how and when it might be better to just acquire these areas, so convert them to public ownership. There's also a lot of interest in continuing and expanding on some existing work that's been done to develop a more formal prioritization or ranking approach. And finally, I think we wouldn't be good economists if we didn't recommend collecting as much data as possible here, for example, about program costs, enrollment rates, and re-enrollment behavior, and all of that would be in service of supporting ongoing improvements to the effectiveness of these programs. And that is all I have. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, Ben. So in the interest of getting us into the discussion groups where we want to allow enough time to hear from you on these topics, I'm going to hold off on questions here. But Jen, are you able to share the slide with the discussion questions? We are, for the next about 20, just over 20 minutes or so, we have time for some discussion and then some brief close out information and next steps afterward. But we've identified 2 questions to guide your discussion. You don't have to spend 10 minutes on each. It can be an organic discussion. I'm going to see if I can pull them up. Sorry, here they come. And oh, we're getting there. So the discussion questions, right? So there's 2, and so we're hoping to hear from you for individuals that are engaged in different incentives programs or have experience with incentive programs. You know, what challenges did you identify? I lost that one. What challenges did you face with those questions, and so what's working, what's not working, and then the second question is, where is there need or opportunity for leveraging market incentive programs to promote Puget Sound ecosystem recovery? So thoughts and ideas you have on that front, like Kathleen raised earlier on the call today, would be great. And we're keeping track of this feedback and synthesizing it, and hope to pull it into a list that we'll share with all of you and with others on where there's some promising research directions here from your collected experience in this space. So that's how we plan to use this time. So Ray Everard from Puget Sound Institute, who's been managing all the tech on this call, is going to divide you all up into 4 breakout groups. So that means Kelly, you're off the hook on the breakout groups for this. We have for the number of people here, we think 4 will work. And then we do hope you come back for the last 10 minutes of wrap up that we have. But there are 4 breakout groups that will be led by some note takers that have been hosting this call. All right, I think we're on here. And the re-recording is up. All right, are we all back, do we think? Those of us that, oh, here's more coming. No, wait here. Okay. I think we're all back in this space now. Who are coming back. So for my part, thank you all for the participation in the breakout group. In my session, we got a lot of good information. I think what we'll do now is maybe go 1 to 4 here through these breakout groups and do just a really quick kind of 2-minute overview of what we heard. And as I mentioned before, we're taking all this information and synthesizing it. So, but maybe we start with Kyle. How'd it go with your group?
It went fantastic with the group. Thank you. I think kind of in general, the kind of a theme that came to the top of our discussion was on how rigid or flexible some of the programs are. That showed up in, let's see, Rebecca brought up how agencies can't work directly with landowners on loans. So working through loan institutions, and that those institutions often have it's just that much, or A, it's just that much more effort for folks, or B, they have their own rules about to whom they can lend. And maybe especially with shoreline homeowners, they would not be within those categories. Also a request to maybe look into, and I think it's look into again, the opportunity to broaden the open space taxation benefit to include shoreline properties. It seems maybe that's been looked into before, but the time might be nigh to take a peek at that again if there's been some contextual changes. Rigidity of programs in general, not specific to lending situations, but of course, federal programs like CREP are a lot more rigid, and so it's a lot harder for those to resonate with folks and for them to choose to benefit from them. And then also amusing on kind of the turnover of homeownership for shoreline properties, and if that is the same or different from Puget Sound properties as a whole or on average, as those would be opportunities to hopefully get folks more engaged in programs, incentive programs. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Kelly, did you want to go next?
Sure. I mean, there's some similarities, right, with the last readout or whatever. But I mean, I think that we had some themes about distrust in people uptaking on incentives or on programming, and so it's not like we got through that, but that being a challenge of incentives, and some of the incentives and programs offered just not being coordinated well, like together, so that they can leverage upon each other or build upon each other, or not sure where people the sort of a trust thing, like where they can go, or if programs change and they're really unsure. So that was kind of a theme a little bit. And then there was also just sort of like an example in Snohomish Riparian Task Force of the opposite of that being folks really working together and sort of covering all bases. So there's the one example of like lack of trust or lack of uptake and sort of dispersed how things are managed in issuing incentives, and lack of transparency of like, what do I get for this? And then the opposite of that being one situation that's working well, where the programming is working well together and thinking of all aspects of it. And that's probably a good case study to go from. And more.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for the good notes. And Jen, did you want to?
Sure. So we also had a great discussion. We talked, a lot about kind of the challenges folks face, or kind of questions about how to make these types of programs work. One theme that arose several times was just the idea of relationships being very, very important, and that pretty frequently those relationships need to be nurtured over a very, very long time. Could be 10 years before you're able to really pull somebody into the program because you've gained trust and they understand what's being asked. And in terms of how that can be done, we pointed at these conservation districts as a place where there really have been these good long-term relationships that offer the opportunity to pull people in to these types of programs because of those established relationships, but that also making it a situation where those districts and the staff are very protective of the relationships with the landowners and wanting to be really careful about what they're asking them to do and how. We talked a lot about just how really, really site-specific, regionally specific payment structures and incentive structures need to be, and that there's a lot of different considerations that are going to change really drastically depending on where you're talking about, and can limit the kind of effectiveness and utility of statewide kind of programs. Another topic that came up was needing to make sure that we, as folks that are really embedded in these topics, aren't jumping to conclusions or making assumptions about what our audience or the folks we're trying to bring in know about the topics. So really making sure you're starting at the beginning. Don't assume somebody knows how a septic system works or how shoreline management works. So they focus on that education perspective and meeting people where they're at. And then also the potential stickiness introduced by the idea of the government kind of offering payments for things that some people perceive should be regulated or that people should be doing anyway. And that can introduce some sensitivities, particularly when you're giving payments to folks that, as was demonstrated in one of the presentations, are some of the higher income earners in the state, and that they're the folks benefiting from these programs. One thing that did come up also, and this is my last thought here, is the in terms of there being political and other differences between people and needing to find a commonality that is making them potentially all want to do the same thing, with the example of a lake community being a place where people might be very different, but they have a central motivation of their lake and their neighborhood, and being able to capitalize on that. And how do we work with like a stream or a river where that is not the type of neighborhood or community that you're working from?
Yeah. All right, thank you. And I'll just give a quick minute here. But in my group, there was some great participation. I just at a high level, that incentives are complex and that sometimes actors don't have the baseline basic understanding both within programs and landowners, and that intellectually they can be interested, but they don't really know whether and how incentives can be helpful for furthering their ecological objectives. We also heard that there's limited funding for better understanding what landowners are willing to accept, what kind of payment would be effective with landowners, for example. So, doing the survey research, going out and collecting information from landowners is limited both by funding and also in just bringing the intended audience to the table, really, where, getting it similar to what Jen said, it takes trust and, a relationship to really even bring landowners to the first place, to the table in the first place to talk about participating. And that oftentimes what you get, there are people who are already motivated to undertake the behavior that you're trying to incentivize. Also that the market evolves quickly, costs evolve quickly. It's hard to keep up with that. That the incentive space is also crowded in addition to people having limited information. And there were some examples given about some of the certification programs, especially in the ag space, that get layered, and how to understand how the differences between those things and how to incentivize participation in those things by breaking that down for people. And then better understanding ecological benefits, and that some programs don't have the staff or ability to quantify those as might be required by some of the ecosystem service markets. So I think this is a lot of great information. We're planning to take it all back and synthesize it. Thanks everyone for participating. Thanks to Ray for the great help and support with the tech, and to Kyle Clifton at OSU and Jen Kazakian, and to the speakers and attendees today. We really appreciate the participation. And the last thing I'll note here is that we have 2 more sessions in this series. The September 18th, there's one focused on the science and strategy of motivating behavior that Kyle Clifton at Oregon State is leading. And there's another one on measuring the effectiveness of incentive programs, both in terms of getting people to voluntarily participate and ecological benefits. And Chris Welly-Wright at Puget Sound Institute is leading that one. So we hope to see you at those future sessions. Thanks all.